Hey, welcome to this week's episode of The People's Report, News for the Left, brought to you by Solidarity TV. Today is February 4th, 2026. How was the city of New Orleans preventing the construction of data centers? What country has already tried universal basic income and may be a blueprint for the future? What country has the US invaded this week? Why are they opening an entertainment-based biobank in the UAE? What are the odds that immigration enforcement in your area will be run by child rapists? When will ICE be opening a death camp in your town? Trump is storing $500 million in offshore accounts. But where? Why are the only people who are not descendants of immigrants having to fear ICE? Spotify thinks it suffered how many trillions of dollars in damages from a pirate named Anna? How many more Palestinian children has Israel killed this week? Do you think the US government should arrest journalists who report on protests? Why is Apple paying Israel for AI facial tracking software? All these topics and more in tonight's episode of The People's Report. Timestamps in the episode description.
Well, don't feel so devastated if you're feeling alienated, because it turns out you're not alone. Just open up your heart, let the revolution start, and grab that megaphone. Solidarity, solidarity, I need you and you need me. Solidarity, 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 solidarity.
New Orleans. City Council puts one-year ban on data center construction in New Orleans East. January 29, 2026, via Fight Back News. On Wednesday, January 28th, dozens of community members showed up to City Council to give public comment on an ordinance around data centers. Councilman Jason Hughes, who presides over New Orleans East, presented the ordinance. MS Solar Grid Data Company proposed building a center in New Orleans East, a historically black, underdeveloped, and impoverished area of the city. The proposal received an injunction, an ordered halt, on the grounds that data center as a type of building is not currently defined in the city ordinance language. Therefore, they are not currently legally allowed to be created in the city. In response, contractors attempted to build data centers under the guise that they are simply office buildings with computers. The City Council resolved to put a moratorium on data centers for 1 year through establishing a Data Center Interim Zoning District, IZD, until they properly define what a data center is. This created an appeals process where contractors could appeal the motion for over the next year. However, the IZD measure would ensure that those appeals would be brought to the public to be deliberated on. City Council members stated that they are staunchly opposed to data centers and intend on banning them entirely once the language is broadly encompassing, citing massive environmental costs, particularly water and energy usage. New Orleans is facing saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico into the Mississippi River, and the electrical grid is famously under-maintained by Entergy, a monopoly that owns the entirety of New Orleans' electrical resources. These issues would be catastrophically intensified if a data center were built and operated in or near the city. 6 of the 7 members of the City Council were present at the meeting. The vote on a 1-year ban passed 5 in favor: Matthew Willard, Leslie Harris, Freddie King III, Eugene Green, Jason Hughes, and 1 abstention, J.P. Morrell, and 1 absent, Amy McCarran. Edith Romero, a member of Eyes on Surveillance, a nonprofit that fights against racist surveillance technologies, echoed the desires of the public commenters, who called for a stronger long-term solution through rigid bans. Romero mentioned that in 2020, the council blocked facial recognition technologies for law enforcement, only to roll back that stance in 2022, justifying the mistrust the community has over the council's promises. I'm certainly glad to see that someone's taking the data center problem seriously, and by someone I mean an actual government body, rather than just almost every single person in America, every single regular citizen in America. The AI data centers are, I don't even know what more there is to say about them that hasn't already been said. They are huge wastes of resources and an incredible drain on the community, stealing water and energy as well as land from a community, potentially polluting the area with sound and other disruptive construction and water runoff, and just overall reducing the quality of life for the people and the animals, not to mention the actual land and plant life itself in the area all around it. And it's no accident that they're trying to build them in New Orleans, in these impoverished and underfunded communities. It reminds me of when the highway system was being built, and a lot of cities used the highways as an excuse to bulldoze and destroy low-income communities that were predominantly communities of color, just in order to purge and expel the black community from the cities. This was done in almost every major city, and that's exactly what I'm being reminded of now, seeing them try to build these data centers in these underfunded communities in New Orleans. New Orleans, of course, has a history of racial violence, not just against black people, but also against Italians and other ethnic minorities of the time. And most recently, maybe not most recently, but quite famously in the Hurricane Katrina incident, when the city got flooded, they blew out the dikes in order to flood black communities in order to preserve wealthy white ones. And then people were shot to death by the police under suspicion of looting, which apparently is a crime punishable by death. The so-called American sniper, Chris Kyle, who eventually got what was coming to him, bragged about sitting on top of I believe it was the Superdome, for the stadium for the New Orleans Saints, I think, and shooting looters, or suspected looters, shooting people who are trying to take care of themselves in their neighborhood. And that's what the job of the state and the job of the police is to do, of course, is to oppress and punish particularly people of color, but poor people in general. So, it's no coincidence that this is where they're trying to build this, and it's also no surprise that people of New Orleans have recognized as a threat to them, specifically a racial threat against them, and the communities resisting surveillance in particular are worried about them. The data centers, of course, are going to be used and are being used to process data from surveillance companies and private and public and military surveillance. We'll talk about this a bit later, but Apple is buying an AI program that's going to surveil people's faces and do micro recognition on facial movements. So, we got so much surveillance built up in this AI sphere. And who are the victims? Of course, they're going to be poor people, especially, but not limited to, people of color. Always going to be the first targets. There's a very good reason why ICE's first deployments I'll say first deployments, but ICE's first targets are Hispanic people, for the ethnic cleansing of the United States of Hispanics. And they're using AI-powered technology in order to find targets with Palantir, and I believe the system is called Elite that we talked about a week or two ago. This is what they're using these AI data centers for. And of course, we the people are always going to be expected to pay the price. Now, with that out of the way, the fact that the city is actually taking a stand against it is pretty surprising. I haven't really seen that in much of the other places where AI data centers are being constructed, where the city itself, not just the people who live in the city, but the city as a government body, is tackling the issue and trying to prohibit or ban data centers. I kind of like this strategy that they're taking, where, well, we can't zone for it because we don't know what they are, an illegal distinction. It's a shame that more places can't do that. I know in some places in the United States, if a facility has a legal and lawful purpose, they can't prohibit it from being constructed in the city. And that's one of the loopholes that data center construction companies are going to be using to get what they want. And of course, they're paying out the ass for it. They're offering people tons and tons and tons and tons of money just to take their land in order to build these data centers on, with the expectation they'll be making mad profits, predominantly from the military-industrial complex. So glad that New Orleans is doing what they can to stop the construction of the AI data centers. Best of luck to them, and I hope that those data centers never get constructed in the state of Louisiana at all. Hey, if you're enjoying the show, consider supporting us at solidaritytelevision.org. Could artificial intelligence and a universal basic income eliminate meaningless jobs? September 23, 2025, via ABC Australia. A universal basic income, or UBI, is a regular, obligation-free payment to everyone. There are different models, but those key elements endure in research studies and pilot projects around the world. When COVID forced people to stay home, between 3.6 million and 4 million Australians were supported by the JobKeeper payment. In addition, a further 2.2 million received some form of welfare payment, such as JobSeeker, enjoyed a top-up payment called the coronavirus supplement that massively boosted, in most cases essentially doubled, their income. At one point, more than 43% of the adult population was receiving a regular, obligation-free payment from the government. The Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Crawford School at the Australian National University says COVID provided a natural experiment of the impact of a basic income. We found that poverty rates for folks that are receiving JobSeeker went from 67% down to 7%, Associate Professor Klein says. The research Klein and her colleagues did found the income boost helped people prepare to enter the labor market, to get out of debt, to meet basic ends, and, of course, to make themselves feel good. It had huge psychological impacts to help people feel that they had dignity again. The Stanford University Basic Income Lab has tallied about 160 global UBI experiments in the last 4 decades. They range in the objective they are focused on, the number of people in the study, and the value of the money they receive. The biggest one is actually Give Directly in Kenya. It's been going on for 12 years, and it's working with over 20,000 Kenyans and over 200 villages, Klein said. Preliminary results from that study are really positive that is showing huge improvement in people's lives. The program, now operating in other African countries, found it decreased infant mortality and family violence, while boosting consumption spending, savings, and local economic activity. 8 years ago, the ABC investigated the possibility of a universal basic income as a response to a rise in automation and increasing computing power. At the time, the estimate to give everyone a payment at the level of the unemployment benefit, then called New Start, was around $240 billion a year, at a time when the overall spend for the Australian government was around $450 billion. In the live example of COVID, the cost of the JobKeeper wage subsidy was $88.9 billion. The coronavirus supplement cost more than $20 billion over 2020 and part of 2021. Even if more generous existing benefits, such as the age and disability pensions, were reduced to the level of a UBI, the net cost would still be huge. You'd still have to find something like 170 to 100 billion annually in order to fund the scheme, Simon Cowan, research director and think tank at the Center for Independent Studies, estimated at the time. People who got access to cash where there was no obligation connected to it, when it wasn't earmarked for anything in particular, they spent it on leisure activities. A lot of people just spent it on things that gave them short-term benefit, he says, while acknowledging that some people paid down debt and that COVID confinement reduced people's ability to spend money outside of their home. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but from the perspective of policy reform, particularly an enormously expensive one, it's hard to imagine that there's a strong societal benefit. On the flip side, Cowan says studies in the U.S. show benefits to cash payments like a UBI. For example, there are some young mothers who, rather than going back into the workforce and putting their kids into childcare, took access to that money and used that to stay at home and spend more time with their kids, he observed. Students or potential students, some of those people will decide to stay at school or go to university rather than go out and work, so there's a benefit in terms of some of the reductions of those pressures. I think I've said this before on the show and expressed it definitely elsewhere in life, but my chief concern with the idea of universal basic income is that I see it as an inevitable, or at least at this moment, an inevitable subsidy for the ruling class. If everyone's going to be getting an extra, say, $2,000 a month, why isn't your landlord just going to raise the rent? If, they know you're going to be able to pay $2,000 a month and you've already been paying, then they can raise the rent by up to $2,000 with the reasonable expectation that you will be able to pay it. Or it will justify employers from cutting hours or cutting staff with the expectation of, oh, well, you know, they're going to get paid anyway. Which isn't, that latter part isn't necessarily a problem. You know, the article is talking about getting rid of, useless jobs. And, you know, the idea of people who work in jobs that kind of suck simply because they have to be able to earn money to put food on the table, getting rid of those jobs isn't necessarily going to be a problem. Like, I'm trying to think of some examples that wouldn't be insulting to perhaps members of the audience, but the gas station attendants in New Jersey, for example. I think New Jersey still requires or doesn't let motorists pump their own gas. And, you know, that's a job that doesn't need to exist. Everybody else in the rest of the country pumps their own gas. You don't need to pay someone to be there to do it. Except for the fact that, you know, people need those jobs. I hate the self-checkouts. Don't take this as a pro self-checkout position. But cashiers at grocery stores aren't treated very well. I don't know of many who enjoy their job, and they're not particularly paid well. I imagine that if those jobs were cut in favor of automated checkouts, and that cut didn't mean that people were going to go broke, I don't know how many grocery store cashiers would be complaining, Walmart, Target employees, etc. Now, I've never worked at retail, at a cashier job at a grocery store or whatever, so I don't know. Maybe people actually do regularly enjoy working at these places. But, and the article does bring it up, this will be an opportunity to address or to not just eliminate these so-called useless jobs, but also prepare people for automation. And in a society in which the people are cared for rather than, the working class is cared for rather than the ruling class. The people are cared for rather than the corporations. The primary value in a society was labor, not capital. This would be a good thing. Automation would be fantastic because it would mean fewer people had to work. But in the society in which we live in, people do have to work, and automation is a poverty driver rather than a liberating aspect of society. So that's my worry about UBI, is that it will help impoverish people, it'll help eliminate jobs, and I don't say dignified work for people who may otherwise need it. And with the fact that I fully expect parasites such as the landlord class to just start jacking up prices on housing and other goods and services beyond what people can afford right now, with the expectation that they'll have an extra $2,000, for an example, in their pocket. Price gouging and inflating prices and whatever in order to steal as much more from the working class, and then those people also aren't getting jobs. I see that as a poverty driver and a almost direct subsidy from the government directly into the pockets of the landlords, especially the landlords. I feel like the landlords are more likely to get away with robbing people blind than anyone else in society, and we know that they already do. So that's my worry and my consternation about it. However, the other complaints that I brought up in the article of, people are going to be using it on leisure. So what, I really hope that you're not spending your UBI check on gambling or other things that could, possibly damage your future. But who cares if they're spending it on luxury groceries instead of, Walmart brand groceries or something like that? People were spending money, and that does go into the economy. And, people definitely have to cut back on their, I don't say frivolous spendings, but on their consumerism for sure. But I really think that having more people with a more reliable source of income, as the article also says, is going to help society by giving people the opportunity and the freedom of mobility to pursue their own interests and their own goals. Maybe it will allow a parent to stay home and actually raise their children rather than relying on the iPad to do it. Maybe it will give students the opportunity to go to school because they know that they don't have to work in order to be able to pay for textbooks or housing or food or to support their family. People will use it to pay off debt. And everyone who's been complaining, the kids these days have to pay off their student loans like I did, well, this will be an opportunity for them to do that. And car payments, mortgage, housing, etc. People will be able to put some aside and not just spend everything they have in order to stay afloat. Assuming, of course, that the owning class doesn't just jack up all the prices and everything in order to just steal the UBI from the constituency, which is what I expect will happen. So the frivolous complaints in the article about people misusing it is not my business. I don't really care how people spend their money as long as it's not being used to abuse themselves or others. If you want to buy, it's like fast food. God forbid someone decide that they're going to get, burgers this week because they have some extra money. That's not my business. I don't really care. And quite frankly, it's not that big of a deal when we have landlords who are robbing them blind of all the other money that they have. I think they deserve a burger. Solidarity Television is an independent grassroots news organization. That means we rely exclusively on viewers like you. Support us at solidaritytelevision.org. U.S. military says some forces have been dispatched to Nigeria. February 3, 2026, via Reuters. The U.S. has sent a small team of troops to Nigeria, the general in charge of the U.S. Command for Africa said on Tuesday, the first acknowledgement of U.S. forces on the ground since Washington struck by air on Christmas Day. President Donald Trump ordered airstrikes on what he described as Islamic State targets in Nigeria in December and said there could be more U.S. military action there. The top general said the U.S. team was sent after both countries agreed that more needed to be done to combat the terrorist threat in West Africa. That has led to increased collaborations between our nations, to include a small U.S. team that brings some unique capabilities from the United States. General Dagvin R.M. Anderson, head of the U.S. military's Africa Command, AFRICOM, told journalists during a press briefing on Tuesday. Anderson did not provide further details about the size and scope of their mission. Defense Minister Christopher Musa confirmed that a team was working in Nigeria, but did not provide further details. A former U.S. official said the U.S. team appeared to be heavily involved in intelligence gathering and enabling Nigerian forces to strike terrorist-affiliated groups. Nigeria has come under intense pressure by Washington to act after President Trump accused the West African nation of failing to protect Christians from Islamist militants operating in the Northwest. The Nigerian government denies any systematic persecution of Christians, saying it is targeting Islamic fighters and other armed groups that attack both Christian and Muslim civilians. Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province, ISWAP, fighters have intensified attacks on military convoys and civilians. The Northwest remains the epicenter of the 17-year Islamist insurgency. The U.S. military's Africa Command said the strike was carried out in Sokoto State in coordination with Nigerian authorities and killed multiple ISIS militants. The strike came after Trump in late October began warning that Christianity faces an existential threat in Nigeria and threatened to militarily intervene in the West African country over what he says is its failure to stop violence targeting Christian communities. Republicans and the conservatives, and kind of Americans at large, always bend over backwards to protect the Christians. Like, oh my God, Christians are being persecuted. Oh no, we have to stop these evil Muslim invaders from destroying Christianity. All the time. This is the justification for the persecution of particularly Syrian refugees all across Europe. So these Muslims are gonna, do the usual anti-immigrant stuff, but like, they're Christian. They're not Christian. They don't share our values. We have to protect Christianity. And they love to whip themselves into a frenzy over the idea that Christians are persecuted, especially in America. Oh, I see stuff online all the time, especially on like Instagram, for whatever reason, seems to have a huge far-right problem. It's like, oh, me and the boys when Christianity is made illegal. Like that's ever going to happen in the United States of America. Like, yeah, sure, this country wasn't strictly Christian when it was founded. These founding fathers were all deists, not Christians. But Christianity is part of the bones of the American empire. It's, of course, religion is the superstructure that runs cover for it. But until we tear down the structure itself, that superstructure of Christianity isn't going to go away. Or you'll have people like Richard Dawkins, I think it was Richard Dawkins, who will complain about, and he'll go on and on about how he's such a big time atheist and about how, these silly people believe in Sky Daddy, or I don't know if those are words he uses. You'll see that a lot online, and hear it in person from people who want to belittle religion. They'll go on and on about the Sky Daddy, aren't these people so stupid? But the minute it comes to Muslims, it's like, oh my God, we have to, we're culturally Christian. I don't believe in Christianity, I'm an atheist, but culturally, it's a big part of our culture, which is obviously just Islamophobic talking points. But as soon as the Christians in question are Palestinian or Syrian or Lebanese, the Christian question doesn't matter. Where the United States is content to bomb churches in Gaza and kill Christians in Gaza. They're content to ethnically cleanse Palestine of all Christians, which is, of course, is exactly what the United States is doing through the terror state of Israel, because the Israelis are not Christian. Of course, that doesn't need to be explained. And many of the Palestinians are. All of the Christians who live in Israel, probably with the exception of a few handful of strangers, are Palestinian. Almost all of the Christians in Lebanon currently being invaded and bombed by Israel on behalf of the United States. All of the Christians there are Lebanese. Obviously because they live in Lebanon, but when Christians are being persecuted by American empire and American regime, where is it time to protect the Christians? We're going to bomb Nigeria over alleged Christian persecution, but we're going to recognize former ISIS soldier as the commander of Syria, and we're going to be all buddy-buddy with him, even though ISIS predominant enemies were always Muslims because they're psychos. But the persecution of Christians, or like I believe the Alawites are largely Christian, and perhaps the Druze as well. I'm not 100% sure. Don't quote me on that. We're going to back ISIS, radical Islamist, actual legitimate radical Islamist terror groups. We're going to back them when they fight against Christians. But when Christians and Muslims fight together in Palestine, we have to destroy the Christians. We have to murder them all and excise them from the country. When Boko Haram's primary enemies, or primary targets, I guess, are Muslim, well, we don't have to worry about that. But as soon as a Christian gets killed, we have to run to their defense. And it's all, smoke and mirrors, of course, to whip American evangelicals in particular into a frenzy to get them to continue to support whatever it is the far right and the right-wing government, both Republican and Democrat, wants to do. So, it's not legitimate at all. But it is very, very worth pointing out that the Christians that America cares about only exist when a rejection of that persecution benefits the American empire. They don't care about Christians at all whatsoever. Just like the United States doesn't care about Jews and is more than happy to be as anti-Semitic as they want to be, as long as anti-Semitism promotes their endgame. They'll be happy to complain about anti-Semitism when they can use anti-Semitism as a defense of Israel, when we have to crush anti-Semites, and by anti-Semites I mean anti-Israeli activists, speakers, persons in society. But of course, as soon as someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene is complaining about Jewish space lasers, crickets. When Christians get murdered in Gaza, when Israel bombs one of the oldest churches in the world in Gaza and threatens everyone inside, crickets. When a single Christian gets killed by Boko Haram in Nigeria, well, now it's time for airstrikes on the country. Did you know the People's Report is produced for video and audio platforms? Stay informed by subscribing to us on YouTube or anywhere you listen to podcasts. A modern-day Noah's Ark is taking shape by the company that brought back the direwolves. February 3rd, 2026, via Complex. A first-of-its-kind biobanking facility aimed at preserving life on Earth has been unveiled in Dubai, where scientists and political figures announced plans to build a permanent backup system for endangered species. As reported by USA Today on Tuesday, February 3rd, the colossal BioVault and World Preservation Lab will be housed inside the Museum of the Future, backed by a 9-figure investment from the United Arab Emirates in partnership with Colossal Biosciences, the Texas-based de-extinction company. The project, being dubbed a modern-day Noah's Ark, debuted this week at the World Government Summit, where attendees previewed an interactive exhibit. Our partnership with the UAE marks the world's first government-led collaboration of its kind, said Colossal CEO Ben Lam. The UAE is setting an important example. Other nations must also invest in critical bioinfrastructure if we are to prevent further biodiversity loss. The BioVault will use cryogenic technology, robotics, and AI to store millions of biological samples, including cell lines, tissue, and genomic data from over 10,000 species that will be placed on the world's 100 most endangered animals, as well as native species in the UAE. Unlike traditional biobanks, the Dubai facility will operate in full public view. Visitors will be able to observe scientists receiving field samples, sequencing DNA, and cryopreserving cells in real time. The BioVault will use cryogenic technology, robotics, and AI to store millions of biological samples. We don't want biobanking done in the back rooms, Lam told Screen Rant. We want it upfront and wrapped with educational content to inspire the next generation to meet the biodiversity crisis. Kids are not only going to inherit our problems, but how we respond to them. Colossal, which has previously discussed the concept on its website, has long advocated for a distributed global network of biobanking sites. The company argues that current efforts are scattered, underfunded, and inaccessible. We are losing species at an alarming rate, and the world urgently needs a distributed network of global biovaults, Lam said. Today's biobanking efforts lack the collaboration and international support this crisis demands. Mayed al-Mansouri, executive director of the Museum of the Future, said the initiative fits the museum's mission to tackle urgent global challenges using technology. I believe the future belongs to those who harness technology and our innovation to address our greatest challenges, he said. We're taking a bold step to advance science that safeguards our planet, restores ecosystems, and builds a sustainable legacy for future generations. So this article is wildly misleading right from the outset. Their assertion that they have de-extincted the direwolf is a complete fabrication. What actually happened was that they did some gene editing on regular wolves in order to give them a more direwolf-like appearance. I'm going to read to you from Wikipedia, unfortunately, but it gives us a pretty good overview of what the reality is in the so-called direwolf project. Independent experts disagreed with Colossal Biosciences' claim that these animals are revived direwolves, asserting that they are not a direwolf under any definition of a species ever. The IUCN Species Survival Commission Candid Specialist Group officially declared that the three animals, that'd be the three so-called direwolves that they created, are neither direwolves nor proxies of the direwolves based on the IUCN SSC guiding principles on creating proxies of extinct species for conservation benefit. They commented that creating phenotypic proxies does not change the conservation status of an extinct species and may instead threaten the extant species such as gray wolves, and therefore concluded that the Colossal Biosciences project, quote, does not contribute to conservation. And this was actually agreed upon by the company itself in May of 25, where the company's chief scientist, Beth Shapiro, stated that the 3 animals are gray wolves with 20 edits, as purportedly stated by the company from the very beginning, acknowledging that it is impossible to bring back an extinct organism, or at least an organism identical to a species that used to be alive, and claimed that the term dire wolves, as applied here, was a colloquialism, branding, if you will. So, the company did not bring back the dire wolf, and so I don't know why we should be expecting it to be able to do anything to preserve. I guess preservation might be a lot more doable than, re-evolving extinct species. But I don't see why we should be really trusting anything this company says at face value when they are so bought into marketing and branding that they completely disregard any sort of scientific accuracy. Of course, the other chief reason to not take this very seriously is the involvement of the UAE. The United Arab Emirates, being a major slave state, with numerous members of its elite being implicated in the Epstein files, is not a partner to anything progressive, scientific, or reasonable. The entire country, for the Emirati population, is effectively a theme park and resort for the rich and an unbearable hellhole for the 60% of the population who are slaves. Additionally, their big ventures, aside from investing in water slides and gene, storage and biovaults, is, of course, genocide in Sudan and their complete failure in their 10-year war on Yemen, where they're constantly being outplayed by the Yemenis and losing Saudi backing every single day. So these guys are, at best, a joke. And by these guys, I mean the entirety of the United Arab Emirates, which is, of course, basically a British airstrip disguised as a country. And the company Colossal Biovault and Colossal Biosciences is a joke in and of itself. Right? So these guys should not be taken seriously much at all, in my opinion. And maybe we'll be surprised. Maybe their biovault and their cryogenic stuff will actually provide useful in the future. Who knows? Maybe these guys are, to an extent, a bunch of goofy nerds who care too much about marketing and are in it for the same reason that Hammond was involved in Jurassic Park, but actually end up making something remarkable, like Hammond in Jurassic Park. Of course, Hammond in Jurassic Park served as a warning, if you will, to the whims of billionaires and their beliefs in their ability to play God. Warnings that Ben Lamb is clearly not heeded. I don't know, maybe he should read the book. He's probably only seen the movie. And of course, the last thing is that this entire thing is being framed like a theme park, where it's going on display for the public to watch as entertainment in this so-called Museum of the Future. So I really don't see this entire project as being anything other than a bunch of billionaires and investors and marketing guys and people who have more gold stolen from Sudan than they know what to do with, basically just clapping each other on the back and saying, wow, what a great job you did. Wow, that's so cool. Wow, you're going to recreate extinct species. Wow, you're going to save the world. Because if these guys were really that intent on saving the world, maybe they wouldn't be dropping bombs in Yemen. Maybe they wouldn't be shipping British military equipment to the RSF in Sudan. Maybe they wouldn't be giving political backing to Israel in their genocide of the Palestinians. Maybe they wouldn't be owning slaves and exploiting the labor of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of predominantly Indian laborers. And maybe they wouldn't be trafficking women and getting involved in massive rape atrocities all the time. If they were actually interested in doing anything pro-social, maybe they would give much of the country back to Oman, to whom it correctly belongs to, and dissolve this barbarous slave state for the pretending to be a country that is popularly known as the United Arab Emirates. If you like the People's Report, check out our other shows at solidaritytv.org. At least 20 ICE and CBP officials have been charged with sex crimes against children. January 27, 2026, via LGBTQ Nation. A list of 30 agents working for Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Patrol shows that 29 of them have been charged with sexual offenses and 2/3 committed sexual crimes against children, according to a list published by the Ohio Immigrant Alliance and the Pacific Anti-Fascist Collective. The off-duty Immigration Customs Enforcement agent who killed Keith Porter Jr. has a history of racism, child abuse, and explosive tempers. Despite murdering Porter in cold blood, Brian Palacios remains free without charge and employed by ICE, the group's website states, invoking the name of Porter, a black 43-year-old father of two who was fatally shot by an ICE officer on New Year's Eve outside his apartment complex. In February 2025, Palacios was barred from having any contact with two of his girlfriend's children, after they testified that he beat his own sons and frequently made homophobic and racist remarks. The members of the all-male list have been charged with offenses like gunpoint sexual assault, child sex trafficking, aggravated assault, robbery, rape, torture, kidnapping, sexual abuse of a minor, and possession and production of child sexual abuse materials. There's a real problem with gender-based violence by ICE agents, and the agency is not taking it seriously, Lynn Tremonte, executive director of the Ohio Immigrant Alliance, said. This culture of violence toward women and children is visible in ICE agents' officially sanctioned actions, and the Department of Homeland Security's unconditional support for their acts of violence, the website further states. The website notes that, according to Ms. Magazine, across the country, so-called ICE impersonators are on the rise as Immigration and Customs Enforcement itself has been violently arresting people without warrants, sometimes in plain clothes using unmarked vehicles. Nearly impossible to distinguish between real and fake agents, men have allegedly lied about their identities to intimidate, kidnap, and rape women with precarious immigration statuses, according to survivors' accounts. ICE has launched a $100 million effort to attract new recruits that include sending geo-targeted advertisements directly to the phones of people located near mixed martial arts fights, NASCAR races, and gun shows. The advertisements use futuristic imagery of war and video games, along with slogans about defending the homeland against invaders. Here I have the list of the 30 ICE or Border Patrol agents who have been charged with or convicted of crimes. Aaron Thomas Mitchell in Arizona committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Alexander Stephen Back of Minnesota, who committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Andrew Golobic in Ohio committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Andrew Smithson, California, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Bart Conrad Yeager in Arizona committed a sex offense against a child, an underage victim. Blake Northway of Oregon committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Dana Ray Thornhill in Arizona committed a sex offense against an underage victim. David Corville, Louisiana, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Efren Lopez Corneo, Arizona, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Harry Marvell Pelez III, Missouri, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Jason Christopher Davis, New Mexico, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Jeremy Tyler Cole, in Arizona, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. John Daly III, the East Valley serial rapist, in Arizona, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. John Jacob Olivas, California, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Juan Lopez, Texas, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Kevin Taylor, Missouri, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Kobe Don Williams, Washington, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Kyle Eldon Mrofka, Arizona, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Luis Uribe, Illinois, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Michael William Behrens, Texas, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Ramon Marquez, Arizona, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Roy Ramirez Jr., Texas, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Salvador Contreras, Texas, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Samuel Saxon, Ohio, committed a non-sexual offense. Scott James Rocky, Missouri, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Spencer Allen Cox, Texas, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Stephen Charles Holmes, Arizona, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Timothy Ryan Gregg, Minnesota, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. Tony L. Barker, National, committed a sex offense against an adult victim. Vernon Lee Milliken, Texas, committed a sex offense against an underage victim. I don't know if you caught that on the list of sex offenders, predominantly against children, and then also one guy who did not commit a sex offense but did some other crime. I don't know if you caught the name of one of them and how he was described as the East Valley serial rapist. These are the kind of people that are employed by ICE and CBP and DHS at large. I'm going to read you an article, a very, very brief article about this person, this pig. Mesa Valley, Arizona Police Department arrests East Valley rapist 22 years after first offense. So understand that he got away with this for 22 years before he finally got caught. The man who came to be known as the East Valley Rapist terrorized the residents of Cochise County from 1999 to 2001. 8 women, each connected by similar suspect behavior, and 3 women connected by DNA evidence, were assaulted in their homes by an unknown assailant. In February 2021, Sexual Assault Kit Initiative identified John Daly III as a suspect. He was booked on 4 counts of sexual assault, 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of burglary, and 3 counts of sexual abuse. Now, he was breaking into women's homes, tying them up, blindfolding them, and sexually assaulting them. And he did this to 8 known women starting in 1999. The first known sexual assault he committed was in July of 1999. And he started working for Border Patrol 4 months later. And he worked there for 20 years. Now, I can only surmise based on the information we're given. But I find it interesting that he stops breaking into people's homes to rape them very shortly after both he started and shortly after he gets involved in Border Patrol and gets a near unlimited access to incredibly vulnerable people whom he can abuse with zero accountability. Just like we're seeing all over the place across the country. Just like we saw a week or 2 ago about that person who was raping women who are being detained in ICE custody. So I have no reason to suspect that this gentleman, and I use the term very loosely, that this person wasn't sexually abusing anyone he could while employed in Border Patrol. And he's one of 29 other rapists that we know of currently involved or who were involved in Border Patrol and ICE. Of course, this is no surprise. The United States regularly produces medieval-style genocidal rape armies. We are fielding one now in Afghanistan, and well, not Afghanistan anymore, thanks to Biden, but in Iraq and in Korea and now in Nigeria and everywhere we go. The United States Army is, again, mass murdering force of sexual criminals. Rape and prostitution rates, and let's be honest, there is no difference. All prostitution is rape. These numbers skyrocket around military bases, U.S. military bases in particular, and one of the benefits of joining the military is the ability, and it's long been discussed, is the ability to go and meet exotic women. And of course, by exotic, we mean women of the global south who can be exploited and abused without their assailants facing any sort of repercussions when they come back home. Very prominent in Vietnam, almost to the point of being a stereotype of American soldiers being mad dog rapists in Southeast Asia, and then also in France and Germany during World War II. In England, this was actually a stereotype of American soldiers stationed in England during World War II, and so on and so forth. We did this to African enslaved individuals, and pretty much anyone we can get our grubby capitalist imperialist little hands on. So it's no different, of course, when we're talking about a violent, ethnically cleansing militia, if you will, private army, running around Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Los Angeles, and the rest of the country, specifically seeking to find and prey on vulnerable people to abuse, vulnerable children to abuse, but especially women. And this is no shock to me. It shouldn't be a shock to you. This is no surprise. This is nothing outside of the ordinary. Regular police are very well known for being sexual criminals. Ask anyone who has been forced to sell their own body on the streets. Police are frequent flyers in the prostitution circuit because they are the ones who get to enforce who goes to jail for the crime of prostitution. And of course, we know that prostitution is rape. And a lot of these police officers expect sexual favors in exchange for not imprisoning people. So they straight up, traditionally speaking, rape women on the streets very, very often. So on one hand, it is very good for us to recognize the sheer amount of sexual violence being committed by ICE and Border Patrol soldiers. On the other hand, we have to take this as an opportunity to recognize that this is not extraordinary, but rather incredibly ordinary, and that mass sexual violence is an everyday part of our culture and community. And we let it slide because we usually don't care about the victims. The fact that we now care about the victims of immigration enforcement is fantastic. It's a radical change of pace from the Obama administration. Even from just 2 years ago with Biden, people were not really all that up in arms about it. And hopefully the recognition of the fact that the people coming into your neighborhood to steal random people off the street, citizen and non-citizen alike, brutalize them, throw them headfirst into walls, or shoot them dead on the street, or drag them to an unknown facility to sexually abuse them, adult and child alike. Hopefully our understanding that this is happening will keep us awake and keep us attentive to when more acceptable imperialist thugs like U.S. veterans, U.S. soldiers, and your everyday police officer do the exact same crimes with complete impunity. This week, in lieu of a book recommendation, we invite you to watch the Black Lion Party press conference at solidaritytv.org. At this conference, the Black Lion Party for International Solidarity introduces themselves, discusses their purpose, values, strategy, and goals, and addresses the social media controversies stirred up around them. Resistance erupts over ICE's warehouse buying spree, February 1st, 2026, via Axios. A massive buyer has entered the market for commercial warehouses, sparking furious local protests. The Department of Homeland Security has scouted dozens of locations to retrofit into ICE detention centers. The biggest ones could hold as many as 9,500 people. ICE's detention population nearly doubled over the past year, but lack of capacity was a bottleneck on mass deportations. Now that it has $45 billion to spend from the Big Beautiful Bill, it's quickly making purchases for hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of the sites are warehouses, previously designed for e-commerce retailers, Bloomberg reported. These sites will need additional spending to retrofit them to house people, for what can legally be up to 6 months, before deportation. In Hanover County, Virginia, anti-ICE protesters flooded a Board of Supervisors meeting to oppose the purchase of a roughly $50 million warehouse, as Axios Richmond's Sabrina Moreno reported. In Hagerstown, Maryland, hundreds of protesters descended on another already purchased warehouse, along with Senator Chris Van Hollen, who has been a vocal voice against ICE's expansions under the Trump administration, according to the Baltimore Banner. Minnesota, Texas, New Hampshire, and New York residents packed county meeting rooms and protested detention expansions in recent weeks, according to local reports. The intensity and aggressive tactics of Trump's immigration enforcement has cratered public support for ICE's mission. The deadly shootings of 2 U.S. citizens in Minneapolis in January have not only provoked public outrage in the city, but has even caused Trump to recalibrate. But Border Czar Tom Homan, who is now leading enforcement operation reforms in Minneapolis, said at a recent press conference this wasn't a retreat from Trump's mass deportation campaign promise to deport millions of people. DHS has already spent more than $170 million on properties in Maryland and Arizona, according to public records reported by Bloomberg. The goal is to have facilities hold approximately 500 people at smaller warehouses and between 7,500 and 9,500 at the largest ones. The federal government directly purchasing these facilities makes it harder for the city and state governments to push back on DHS plans. The Trump administration has tried numerous schemes to quickly scale up detention capacity. State-run sites like Alligator Alcatraz brought hundreds of additional beds online, as well as litigation over detention standards. Agreements with local jails, usually run by sheriffs, were heavily promoted by Homan and the administration in Trump's first year in office. But local jails are often not suitable or adequately resourced for long-term stays. Private prison contractors, namely Geo Group and CoreCivic, have also been tapped to open more bed space. But on earnings calls last quarter, both companies said they had untapped capacity still available. Almost 70,000 people are currently being held by ICE, according to the latest figures in January. These warehouse prisons are, of course, deeply concerning to anyone with a conscience. We all know that warehouses are designed to store goods, and they're not designed for people. And obviously, they're investing a ton of money into rebuilding these. ICE now has a budget bigger than the United States Marines, and that's what they're going to be doing with a lot of their money, is building all this new infrastructure. However, converting things used to hold and store and transport goods into things to hold, store, and transport persons is a disconcerting image. It reminds one of people being shipped around in boxcars, or of people being held in squalor during the era of chattel slavery in the United States. Some of the things that they're using or installing in these warehouses are disconcerting. I'm going to read some of them from an article here from Nation of Change. Contract line items described in the reporting include closed tents likely intended for medical treatment, industrial-sized grills for food preparation, and extensive force protection equipment such as earth-filled defensive barriers, 8-foot-high Conex box walls, and weather-resistant guard shacks. The contract also includes provisions for medical waste management, including protocols for biohazard incinerators. So this is more like a maximum security prison or some sort of fortress instead of a detention center. This is, of course, more or less a concentration camp for so-called illegal immigrants. The sheer mass population that they're going to be interning here is a stomach-turning. And, one can't help, it's been pointed out before, but one can't help create a picture in one's mind of what it is they're building here with, these massive defensive barriers and walls and guard towers, and then, following it up with construction of incinerators, ostensibly for biohazards. Now, they probably are being intended for some sort of biohazards, but that doesn't make it any better. I know there are people panicking, thinking that they're, going to be using them to kill and destroy the bodies of immigrants. I don't know. I don't think that's off the table by a long shot, but let's try to keep off the panic for a moment. The problem is, as epidemiologist and health economist Eric Feigelding points out, these provisions are, in his words, extra chilling, as this infrastructure is designed to handle mass illness and death. So the consternation here is the spread of disease. They are not intending to pay attention to the medical needs of the people that they are interning. And they are not intending to have a population that is healthy. They have every expectation that people will get sick, that biohazards will be prominent enough that they can't ship them off-site and will need to destroy them on-site, and that quite possibly this indicates an expectation of death. Now, I don't like making a whole lot of Holocaust comparisons. I feel like that in a lot of ways it's us jumping the gun. But it is important to remember that a lot of, if not most of, the people who were killed in the Holocaust, especially in the concentration camps, were not killed by being gassed or shot, but rather through disease and starvation. And I feel like that is not an unreasonable expectation to get out of these ICE detention centers, these ICE concentration camps. I don't think, despite the size of their grills, I don't think they exactly expect to be feeding everybody well. They certainly won't be, getting good, healthy exercise like in a more traditional prison. And not to say that traditional prisons are good by any stretch of the imagination. Our prison industrial complex is barbaric. But, what we're looking at here for people who the government has already decided are subhuman trash, we're looking at ways to manage and dispose of trash rather than take care of human beings. So it's very, very imperative that we all do what we can to prevent these structures from being built in our communities, whether that be from lobbying local government, like we saw other people doing across the country, or if that means direct action and directly preventing the construction and opening of these prisons. Now, I don't know what all that would look like. You'd have to figure that out on your own, on the ground, with people in your community. Get organized, get angry, get active. We need to prevent these concentration camps from being built. We need to do everything we can to prevent ICE and CBP and the DHS as a whole from grabbing people, any people, off the streets. We need to make the existence of ICE completely politically intolerable. We need to commit ourselves to not vote for anybody who would support any immigration enforcement, not just immigration enforcement from a gentleman wearing a blue tie instead of those wearing red ones. We need to rethink Obama's legacy as being the deporter-in-chief. And we need to kill this idea of liberalism. I've been seeing too much of people saying that, when Obama did it or when Biden did it, he did it the right way. He wasn't brutalizing people. He wasn't terrorizing families, which is untrue. Of course he was. Ask anyone in Libya, but especially here in the United States, ICE has always been breaking up families, always been terrorizing immigrant communities ever since they were invented in 2002. So we need to dissolve the DHS. We need to get people. I'm not a big electoralist. We're not going to solve everything or pretty much anything through electoralism. We are never going to vote our way out of this. But when we do use voting as one of the many tools in our arsenal against imperialism, we have to make sure that all the candidates we vote for and all the candidates we run are going to be vehemently anti-ICE. We need to dissolve ICE. And honestly, the entire DHS needs to go. We can't have people who want to have nice ICE. We have to get people who want to abolish ICE. And where that fails, we as individuals in the community need to become organized as a community and stop this ourselves by any means necessary. Hey comrades, remember the words of Chairman Mao: civilize the mind and make savage the body. In order to outperform ICE, we must first match their physical fitness standards. If it makes sense for you, start training with push-ups so we can exceed their goal of 22 push-ups in 1 minute or less. Trump holding millions from Venezuelan oil deal in Qatar. January 14, 2026, via Raw Story. President Donald Trump's administration was reportedly holding part of the proceeds from a deal made for seized Venezuelan oil in offshore accounts in Qatar. An administration official told Semaphore that the total value of the first sale of Venezuelan oil was $500 million. The move comes just days after the U.S. military conducted strikes on Venezuela and took its leader, Nicolas Maduro, into custody. Trump has said that the U.S. would run Venezuela for an indefinite period of time, including taking control of 50 million barrels of oil. The president also indicated that he would not pay back Venezuela's debts, saying the U.S. is not going to look at what people lost in the past, because that was their fault. Revenue from the oil sales is currently being held in bank accounts controlled by the U.S. government, as indicated in Friday's order, according to the administration official, Semaphore reported. The main account, according to a second senior administration official, is located in Qatar. The second official described Qatar as a neutral location where money can flow freely with U.S. approval and without risk of seizure, the report added. Trump's order noted that at least some of the revenue would be held in U.S. Treasury accounts. The idea of holding money from Venezuela oil sales in foreign countries has already sparked criticism from some Democrats. There is no basis in law for a president to set up an offshore account that he controls so that he can sell assets seized by the American military, Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts said recently. That is precisely a move that a corrupt politician would be attracted to. I don't know, guys. I think this is a pretty clear example of just blatant corruption, right? There's the money taken from... We'll even be generous. We'll pretend for the next minute or two that the oil wasn't stolen in an open act of theft and imperial conquest, really. Let's pretend that it was sold, taken and sold entirely on the level. And then the money isn't transferred to U.S. Treasury accounts, instead being stored in accounts controlled ostensibly by the United States government on offshore accounts in foreign countries. I don't know. This feels insanely corrupt. Now, granted, I don't know how frequent this has been in U.S. finance and economics. Usually, we all know as citizens of the world that the offshore bank account thing is a way to dodge taxes or scrutiny or investigation. The money, Trump says, is being stored in Qatar because it can flow freely without the risk of seizure, whatever that means. And it just seems and just feels incredibly corrupt, and it's transparently so. It's also interesting because I believe it was Qatar that gave Donald Trump that airplane, an Air Force One, and is having a joint exercise Air Force with our Air Force base over in Idaho. It's very strange. And of course, Qatar, despite being one of the residences of leaders of the Axis of Resistance, is clearly not a real friend of resistance to U.S. imperialism, but rather just a much less lethal and much less engaged perpetrator of American imperial violence. Now, this money comes from the theft of oil. After the United States launched, I don't know if you'd call it a soft coup, and the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro and the seizure of him, the mass murder of, and quite likely execution of Cuban nationals in Venezuela, and the mass murder of Venezuelan security forces, the kidnapping and detention of a foreign president that went totally unchallenged in the international community. Nobody raised a finger to assist Venezuela or to punish the United States. Nobody cared. Nobody who had the power to do anything cared. Even China just entirely shrugged it off. Unsurprising, maybe. And that oil coming from just the theft and molestation of Venezuela is being sold for the private benefit of the United States government, or more likely of individuals, private individuals within the United States government. How much more blatant can you get of imperialist looting, other than, the photos of, I think it was Tom Cotton, sitting on a giant stack of gold looted from the coffers of the Iraqi government back in 2003 or whatever. Just this blatant imperialist violence. And of course we know imperialism is the final form of capitalism. It is, maybe what you'd call late stage capitalism. All of the other markets have been cornered, and now we have to plunder the existing markets from other people and crush all sort and all sense of sovereignty outside of that of American sovereignty. So this is par for the course for the United States. This is nothing new. It's maybe garish, because that's Trump's whole MO, is obscene and garish, but he doesn't do anything really particularly unusual for the U.S. empire. And that's what this is. This is the looting of Venezuela, and money that should be going to the Venezuelan people being just confiscated from the United States, or by the United States. The one interesting thing about this article, though, is the refusal of the United States to pay Venezuela's debts. And I'm not sure if that's debts we owe to Venezuela, or if the United States, in its claim that we now run Venezuela, is now refusing to pay any debt that Venezuela owes, which is honestly kind of funny. That's a move Andrew Jackson pulled with France, and it worked actually for him. It shouldn't have, but it did. So I don't know. That's something to keep an eye on, is Trump's relationship with the debt in Venezuela. We'll have to look more into that and see what ends up happening with that, if anything at all. But the money that is being deposited in these Qatari bank accounts by the United States is, of course, money directly, or maybe indirectly, but stolen deliberately from the Venezuelan people, to whom that oil belonged to in the first place. They're the ones who, yes, own the land in which the oil was found, but also they're the ones who did all of the work to get it on those ships. They extracted it, refined it, loaded it, etc., etc., etc. It's their oil to do with what they wish, and American plundering of their oil to open up and to maintain control over markets and the oil market at large is obscene. Again, we've hardly seen anything this brazen. Even George Bush had the sense to pretend that the invasion of Iraq wasn't over natural resources, that the toppling of Syria didn't involve the theft of oil. And here Donald Trump's just out here saying it. I wonder if that eats Bush up a bit. Hey, it'd mean a lot if you join our Patreon at solidaritytelevision.org. Fearing ICE, Native Americans rushed to prove their right to belong in the United States. January 30th, 2026, via AP News. When U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement flooded Minneapolis, Shane Mance dug his Choctaw Nation citizenship card out of a box on his dresser and slid it into his wallet. Some strangers mistake the pest control company manager for Latino, he said, and he fears getting caught up in ICE raids. Like Mance, many Native Americans are carrying tribal documents proving their U.S. citizenship in case they are stopped or questioned by federal immigration agents. This is why dozens of the 575 federally recognized Native nations are making it easier to get tribal IDs. They're waiving fees, lowering the age of eligibility, ranging from 5 to 18 nationwide, and printing the cards faster. It's the first time tribal IDs have been widely used as proof of U.S. citizenship and protection against federal law enforcement, said David Wilkins, an expert on Native politics and governance at the University of Richmond. I don't think there's anything historically comparable, Wilkins said. I find it terribly frustrating and disheartening. Since the mid to late 1800s, the U.S. government has kept detailed genealogical records to estimate Native Americans' fraction of Indian blood and to determine their eligibility for healthcare, housing, education, and other services owed under federal legal responsibilities. Those records were also used to aid federal assimilation efforts and chip away at tribal sovereignty, communal lands, and identity. Beginning in the late 1960s, many tribal nations began issuing their own forms of identification. In the last 2 decades, tribal photo ID cards have become commonplace and can be used to vote in tribal elections, to prove U.S. work eligibility, and for domestic air travel. About 70% of Native Americans live in urban areas, including tens of thousands in the Twin Cities, one of the largest urban Native populations in the country. There in early January, a top ICE official announced the largest immigration operation ever. Masked, heavily armed agents traveling in convoys of unmarked SUVs became commonplace in some neighborhoods. By this week, more than 3,400 people had been arrested, according to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. At least 2,000 ICE officers and 1,000 Border Patrol officers were on the ground. Representatives from at least 10 tribes traveled hundreds of miles to Minneapolis to accept ID applications from members there. Among them were Lac-Courte Orioles Band of Ojibwa from Wisconsin, the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyote of South Dakota, and the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa of Northern Dakota. Peter Yatzy, who is Navajo, said he was arrested and held by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement in Phoenix for several hours last week. Yatzy, a construction worker from Chinle, Arizona, said he was sitting in his car at a gas station preparing for a day of work when he saw ICE officers arrest some Latino men. The officers soon turned their attention to Yatzy, pushed him to the ground, and searched his vehicle, he said. He told them where to find his driver's license, birth certificate, and a federal certificate of degree of Indian blood. Yatzy said the car he was in is registered to his mother. Officers said the names didn't match, he said, and he was arrested, taken to a nearby detention center, and held for about 4 hours. It's an ugly feeling. It makes you feel less human, to know that people see your features and think so little of you, he said. In September, the Supreme Court allowed ICE agents to use a person's apparent race and ethnicity as a factor in deciding whether to detain them. The court ruling that immigration officers can arrest and detain people under suspicion of their immigration status based solely on their ethnic appearance is... I don't even have words for how obscene that is. Now we know that this is, again, not particularly unusual. We'll go back to the Fugitive Slave Act, where tons of Black Americans who were born free and were free their whole lives were kidnapped by slavers from the South and dragged into chattel slavery in the South, which they could get away with because the kidnapped gentlemen were Black. Which is exactly how we did it to people in Africa anyway. To ethnic discrimination against Muslims more recently within the global war on terror era, which we're still kind of in. And, racial profiling, snatching up Japanese Americans for the crime of being Japanese. It's just hateful discrimination disguised as law enforcement. And to think that the some of the victims getting caught up in this barbarous dragnet are indigenous Americans is, I don't even want to call it funny. It's so absurd that indigenous Americans are believed to look Hispanic enough that it is legal for the government to send its goon squad out to harass and abuse these people, especially under the guise of illegal immigration. Obviously, indigenous Americans are the only people group in the United States who are not immigrants in any sense of the word. They are not descended from immigrants. They were the indigenous people here. White Americans are the descendants of immigrants, of course. Hispanic Americans are the descendants of immigrants. Asian Americans are the descendant of immigrants. Black Americans, I hesitate to say are the descendant of immigrants because their relationship with that trip over here from Africa is not exactly one of immigration. But they are, of course, the descendants of foreign-born individuals, we'll say. And the Native Americans, of course, being the first people on this land, even though they did, of course, come from all the way back from Africa, are the first people here. So they have the claimed indigeneity here. And the fact that we are, of course, we being the white American establishment, has already oppressed and ethnically cleansed much of the country of the indigenous population. Mass murder, both deliberate and less deliberate through the spread of disease, and intentional genocide through the eradication of the buffalo to create starvation and to destroy culture and the way of life. And on top of it, of all of it, at the end of the day, we still have, blood records to check people's, genetic heritage, which, I don't know. Nothing about that sits well with me. Maybe you would have to talk to a person of a person within the indigenous community to get a more thorough analysis of how that feels. But then to see them brutalized by white nationalist thugs because they look like the wrong ethnicity is sickening. And it should sicken you. And I don't think it's an accident either. Yeah, I do think that a lot of these ICE and CBP guys are just the dumbest of the bunch. Generally speaking, intelligent people don't take it upon themselves to see their relationship with their neighbors as one of being conquest. But, it's not, being dumb doesn't make you evil either. So we got these guys running around there being permitted to do all sorts of hateful activities. And the Twin Cities is a huge place for indigenous Americans. If I remember my history correctly, the Great Lakes region, especially up there near Minnesota, is home to the Ojibwa people, who Americans mostly refer to as the Chippewa. And they pretty much got along with the United States as much as one reasonably could for a long time. And they have one of the, if not the largest indigenous population in the United States, that people group. And I think one of the biggest in Canada as well, just on the other side of the border. And the American Indian movement, AIM, originates out of the Twin Cities, or at least of that region. And for good reason. This is where a lot of indigenous people live in urban settings. There aren't too many Native American people in the United States in general, but there's a very large concentration in Minnesota. And so these people who are by nature a reminder of the fact that the white settler project is a settler colonial project, and that the land does not belong to and is not designed to be exploited by white Americans, is an offense and a threat in its own way to the American imperial order. So I don't think that these abuses of Native Americans are particularly unintentional. And I do think that there's a lot of permissiveness about the abuse of Native Americans here in the United States. And of course there is. It's built on the genocide of the Native Americans, and it's a project that has to be continuously maintained. So these abuses of the Native Americans and the discrimination against them and the arrest is not an accident. It's not maybe the most intentional, but it's certainly viewed favorably by the ruling establishment. Another way you can support us is by following us on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Spotify and Big Three record labels sue Anna's Archive for $13 trillion, alleging theft. January 27, 2026, via Consequence. Spotify and the Big Three record labels, Universal Music Group, Sony Music Entertainment, and Warner Music Group, have filed a lawsuit against Anna's Archive, alleging the pirate platform scraped 86 million music files and claiming an eye-popping $13 trillion in damages. Anna's Archive, formerly known as a Pirate Library Manor, posted in a December 20th blog post that they plan to create the world's first preservation archive for music, available through BitTorrent, which they said would ensure that lesser-known recordings wouldn't disappear. The suit accuses them of brazen theft of millions of files containing nearly all of the world's commercial sound recordings, according to the full complaint. Via Music Business Worldwide, the lawsuit was filed on December 26th and unsealed January 16th. The labels and Spotify sought a temporary restraining order on January 2nd, and Anna's Archive did not respond by the court-appointed date of January 16th. Judge Jed S. Raskov issued a preliminary injunction against the platform on January 20th, ordering domain registries and hosting providers to disable access to Anna's Archive domains, such as annasarchive.li, annasarchive.pm, and annasarchive.ni. Yeah, we're on Spotify. It doesn't mean we like it. We all know they're a dog shit corporation. The monopoly over the music industry is not something I personally am incredibly well educated or well versed in. But the way that music as a whole can just be owned by a small handful of companies and, leased and controlled at will is, I think, just anti-art. The so-called pirate platform is something I wish I had found out before this article was published. I'd like to make more use of it. I found them. The one website is still running, and I had them pulled up here just earlier. I haven't tried to do anything much on it yet, though, so your mileage may vary. And the so-called piracy, especially for, multiple trillions of dollars, is, in my opinion, kind of a farce. The understanding is that, well, piracy is a crime. Digital piracy, of course, is a crime because it steals stuff. But let's be honest, the publishers don't lose anything. If I pirate a video game and then uninstall it and then pirate it again, and I do that, 60,000 times, do they lose, hundreds of thousands of dollars? No, nothing has changed. It's a good or service. It's a manufactured good, if you will, that one would not access except through piracy. There's plenty of games or movies that if I had to pay for them, I just wouldn't watch or wouldn't play. And same goes for music. If people were tired of Spotify's, just as an example, Spotify's ads all the time. I believe they run ICE ads now for the Border Patrol and whatnot. And the option was steal the music or not listen to the music. of course people are going to steal the music. And the idea that this is theft is just way off the wall. It's a dramatic stretch. Again, when you illegally download something, it's not being taken off the market. It's not being taken at all. Just another person has access to it that they're not intended to. It's not theft. That's, I don't know, trespassing, maybe? If you sneak into a movie theater, you're not stealing the movie. You're trespassing. Maybe a seat. It could be argued you're stealing a seat from somebody. But, if the seat is digital and they can just make as infinite amounts of seats to satisfy demand, you're not really stealing anything. So, and the amount of money is just ludicrous. Multiple trillions of dollars. Honestly, it's so absurd that I almost don't feel it's worth spending a lot of time discussing. It's greed, it's corporate greed, sneaking its way into people's pockets and trying to sneak music out of people's pockets. Music is a cultural touchstone. It shouldn't belong to people. It, belongs to everybody. And especially because if they're, Anna's stated mission, which is to make sure that, very undervalued recordings don't get lost or destroyed. There have been songs that I've listened to on music player apps that weren't downloaded, that were streamed, that just one day were just taken off. Why? I don't know. Or artists, Neil Diamond, I think, was one of the big artists who took all of his music off at least Spotify. So, where else is the average everyday person, especially someone young who isn't familiar or might not have physical media music players like CD players or DVD players or record players, and might not be all that familiar with how to download music onto something like an MP3 player, especially if everything's constantly streamed and licensed rather than being purchased and downloaded like it used to be. So, where are they going to get access to this music? So, I don't know, it's clearly meant to send a message rather than to actually deliver a result. And hopefully the so-called pirates continue to sink these merchant ships. If you're enjoying the show, consider supporting us at solidaritytelevision.org. Children among 31 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces across Gaza. January 31st, 2026, via Al Jazeera. Relentless Israeli bombardment has killed at least 31 Palestinians, including 6 children and several police officers, in Gaza, a day before the Rafah border crossing is due to reopen. An Israeli airstrike on Saturday on a tent sheltering displaced people killed at least 7 Palestinians, including 3 children, in the Al-Mawasi area to the northwest of Khan Yunis, medical sources told Al Jazeera. Their bodies were taken to the Nasser Medical Complex in Khan Yunis. In Gaza City, emergency services reported that an Israeli air attack killed at least 5 Palestinians, including 3 children, in an apartment building in the Ramal neighborhood to the west of the city. We could feel the shockwaves of the explosions, followed by a huge, dark, dusty cloud that filled the area, leaving at least 5 people killed inside the residential flat, including a mother and children. Al Jazeera's Hani Mohamed reported from Gaza City. 8 Palestinians were also injured in an Israeli bombing of an apartment building in the Daraj neighborhood of Gaza City. All of this is happening inside the Yellow Line, Mahmoud said, referring to the demarcation line where the Israeli army withdrew to under the first phase of the first Gaza ceasefire that came into effect in October. He added that Khan Yunis, a building, had been hit by fighter jets and destroyed completely after it was pre-warned by the Israeli military. The head of the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, condemned the latest Israeli attacks, describing the truce as a ceasefire in name only. A ceasefire means guns fall silent and give way to efforts to end the war, Philippe Lazzarini posted on Twitter. People in Gaza deserve a genuine ceasefire, a much overdue ceasefire. Egypt and Qatar, the key mediators for the ceasefire, also condemned the latest Israeli violations. Egypt demanded that all parties exercise the utmost restraint ahead of Sunday's planned reopening of the Rafah crossing, which links Gaza and Egypt. Qatar said the violence was a dangerous escalation that will inflame the situation and undermine regional and international efforts aimed at consolidating the truce. Israel's military said its latest strikes were in retaliation for an incident on Friday in which 8 Palestinian fighters exited a tunnel in Rafah, which Israel said violated the ceasefire. It said forces struck 4 commanders and additional terrorists from the Hamas and Islamic Jihad terror organizations across the Gaza Strip. Hamas Political Bureau member Suhail al-Hindi rejected the Israeli army's claims. What happened today is a fully fledged crime committed by a criminal entity that does not abide by agreements or respect any commitments, he told the AFP news agency. Gaza's government media office said at least 524 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces since the United States brokered ceasefire came into effect. Residents in the border town of Rafah also reported several air attacks in areas under Israeli control. Israel is due to reopen the Rafah crossing on Sunday for the first time since May 24. The opening of the key entry point is part of the second phase of Israel's ceasefire agreement with Hamas. It was meant to open during the first phase, but Israel refused to do so until the body of its last remaining captive held in Gaza, Ran Gvili, was found and laid to rest earlier in the week. Israel on Saturday said it would allow only a limited movement of people who have received security clearance by Israel to enter and exit. No aid or humanitarian supplies will be allowed to enter. Munir al-Bursh, Director General of the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, told Al Jazeera that the health situation in the territory is extremely dire, noting that medical supplies are rapidly running out. He called for the entry of medical supplies and the facilitation of evacuations for wounded Palestinians to receive treatment outside the Gaza Strip. The Rafah crossing will be overseen by multiple parties, including Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, and a European Union mission, but Israel retains control over who is allowed to enter and exit. Only those who fled during the past 2 years are allowed to come back, Mahmoud explained. Those who are born outside the Gaza Strip are not going to be allowed to come back. Hamas responded to the Rafah announcement by calling for Israel to allow movement in and out of Gaza without restrictions, and urged it to adhere to all aspects of the ceasefire agreement. Israel's genocidal war on Gaza has killed more than 71,600 Palestinians since October 7, 2023. I've never heard of a ceasefire in which only one side stops fighting and everyone still pretends that there's no fighting going on. The Israeli genocide of the Palestinians, of course, the American genocide of the Palestinians, is ongoing. We have 574 people killed since the start of the so-called ceasefire. Palestinians, of course, all Palestinians. And it's just not stopping. It's just at a lull. People's homes are still being blown up. I know one woman who's been terrified of going to bed every night because even though she has a house, the building that her house is in is so unstable. When the shells go off nearby, the plaster falls off the ceiling, and they're constantly worried that the building is going to collapse one of these nights. But even with their, adherence to each stage of the ceasefire, for as much as we can pretend that they're adhering to it, this is the first time in 2 or 3 decades, I want to say, that no Israelis are being interred in Gaza. Of course, thousands of Palestinians are being interred in Israeli prisons, getting regularly beaten, raped, and sexually assaulted by dogs at the behest of Israeli soldiers, having their prison dogs rape prisoners, both male and female IDF soldiers alike. They're all pigs who deserve an early grave. But one of the darkest aspects of even the reopening of the crossing is in this section here. Only those who fled during the past 2 years are allowed to come back. Those who are born outside the Gaza Strip are not going to be allowed to come back. And what might be easily overlooked there is that so many families left Gaza when they had the opportunity to, and since then have had children waiting to return. Pregnant women who fled Gaza during the early months of the war, gave birth outside of the Gaza Strip, and now either aren't allowed to come home or have to abandon their very small children. And this, of course, is a deliberate choice to make sure that there are fewer families in Gaza. Israel wants to ethnically cleanse the entire strip. They want to make sure that these families have no motivation to come back, or no opportunity to come back, barring that. And one of the ways that they do this is by preventing families from moving if any member of the family has been born outside of the Gaza Strip. So you have to be born there in order to stay there. And again, if you were forced out due to Israeli ethnic cleansing, even if you intended for it to be temporary, but you had a child, well, you're either stuck outside of the Strip or you have to abandon your child. And I can't imagine any Palestinian mother or father is going to abandon their child to move back. And that's exactly what the state of Israel is counting on. Additionally, their excuses for continuing the bombardment are incredibly flimsy. They're saying that 8 Palestinian fighters came out of the tunnels. That's it. They're not saying that they came out of the tunnels and did anything. It's that 8 Palestinian fighters came out of the tunnels, and so they killed 31 people in retaliation. 31 random people in retaliation. They always claim, it's Hamas, it's the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as if, that makes it better. I've said this before, but every Palestinian is an innocent, even when they carry a gun. And every Israeli is an imperial soldier, even if they only carry a flower. Because in order to plant the flower, they have to steal the earth, the water, and even the sun and the sky. So the act of existing as a Palestinian resistance fighter in Gaza should not be a death sentence. Of course, we know the UN has ruled that they have a right to resist, and they are right to resist. You would resist too if you were in their situation. And just being there is not any justification for bombing. Of course, the United States and France and England and all of the world powers don't care. They either completely support Israel or they are entirely unwilling to get involved, like China, who continues to have strong economic ties with Israel regardless of the genocide. So, as we move forward in the so-called peace process, as we're looking down into Ramadan in just 2 weeks, we have to keep in mind that the genocide of the Palestinians is not ceased just because the majority of the fighting has subsided and people are still being killed, they're still being bombed, they're still being shot. And no one but Hamas, no one but the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, no one but the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine or the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, no one but maybe Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, and on occasion Iran, is standing up to fight for these people. The United States is not, England is not, France is not, China is not. The North of Korea is actually. The North of Korea has been supporting the Palestinian cause for as long as they've needed to, because they understand what it's like to suffer from a genocidal bombing campaign at the hands of American imperialists. And just straight up, it's the right thing to do. That's why we all support the Palestinian resistance, even though we've never been bombed by the United States government. It's simply the right thing to do. And we won't see peace in Palestine, when probably not peace in the Middle East, until Israel is entirely dissolved. If you like the People's Report, Check out our other shows at solidaritytv.org. Journalist Don Lemon arrested in connection to Minnesota ICE protest, January 30th, 2026, via Al Jazeera. Press freedom groups decry arrest of former CNN anchor as lawyer pledges to fight charges vigorously. Journalist Don Lemon has been arrested in connection with his coverage of a protest against United States President Donald Trump's deadly immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota. Lemon's lawyer, Abby Lowell, said on Friday that the journalist had been arrested in Los Angeles, where he was covering the Grammy Awards. Lemon was charged with conspiracy and interfering with the First Amendment rights of worshippers related to his attendance at a January 18th protest, in which demonstrators disrupted a church service in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. Don had been a journalist for 30 years, and his constitutionally protected work in Minneapolis was no different than what he has always done, Lowell said in a statement. He pointed to the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which protects the freedom of the press. The First Amendment exists to protect journalists whose role it is to shine light on the truth and hold those in power accountable, Lowell said. Don will fight these charges vigorously and thoroughly in court. Lemon was part of a series of arrests that morning, all related to the church demonstration. They included independent journalist Georgia Fort, as well as activists Jamal Lindolani and Trayvon Jean Cruz. Federal authorities had previously arrested Minneapolis civil rights lawyer Nikema Levy Armstrong and 2 others in connection with the protest. Press freedom groups swiftly condemned the action, which they called a major escalation in the administration's attacks on journalists. The unmistakable message is that journalists must tread cautiously because the government is looking for any way to target them, Seth Stern, the chief of advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, said in a statement. The National Press Club has also denounced arrests in a statement. Arresting or detaining journalists for covering protests, public events, or government actions represents a grave threat to the press freedom and risks chilling reporting nationwide, it wrote. Lemon had previously been an anchor for the CNN News Network, but he was fired in 2023. He has since worked as an independent journalist with a prominent presence on YouTube. During his online report from the church protest, Lemon repeatedly identified himself as a reporter, as he interviewed both demonstrators and church attendees. Protesters had targeted the church, which belongs to the Southern Baptist Convention, due to its pastor, David Easterwood, who also holds a role as the head of a field office for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Friday's arrests come after a federal judge in Minnesota took the rare move last week of refusing to sign an arrest warrant for Lemon. Justice Department officials nevertheless promised to continue pursuing charges. Would it surprise anyone in our audience to learn that the 4 journalists arrested by the Trump administration for covering the atrocities ICE is committing in Minneapolis, that all 4 of them were black journalists? I'm not surprised myself. You probably aren't either. I don't know whether or not these journalists would have been arrested were they white, but I do know that none of the white journalists were arrested. And, of course, under what crime? Is for, allegedly disruption of, First Amendment activities, because they they were reporting on a protest taking place inside a church during a church service, and that they were present for. Journalists are absolutely permitted to be present at the scene of events. I'm certainly not going to call them crimes. At the scene of events. And given that these journalists were there to report on those events in order to take maybe an attempt at an impartial position, and such as Don Lemon interviewing both protesters and churchgoers, was just very clearly an act of very normal, traditional journalism that wasn't even particularly brave, I guess. It wasn't a disruptive journalism. It wasn't an act of super engagement. It's very standard boilerplate style journalism. Not to mention the fact that the so-called First Amendment protected activities of going to church, which, yes, they should be protected by the First Amendment, as should journalism, but the place of worship was a site of a protest because of the criminal activities that the preacher was getting up to. He was helping to run ICE facilities. So the disruption was not religiously motivated. It was not an attack on Christians like Trump loves to pretend is happening and his goon squads love to pretend is happening. It was a demonstration against a specific individual for doing specific anti-society actions. It reminds me of the protests you see often in New York, in Brooklyn, and in places in New Jersey like Teaneck, where synagogues will be the site for illegal land sales to recruit more American Jews to be violent, hateful settlers in Palestine, to ethnically cleanse people from particularly the West Bank, violently kick them out of their homes, and get involved in the Hilltop Youth, which only suspiciously sounds a lot like Hitler Youth, but they do the exact same thing. And when the protesters go up there, then you get people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rushing in to defend the Zionists and the land sales under the cries of religious freedom, as if anyone has the religious freedom to sell somebody else's house and murder them for being the wrong ethnicity. No one has the religious freedom to run ICE and work for ICE and then also try to be a man of God. You cannot be both a man of God and an agent of empire. Very famously, this is what the New Testament is all about, and this is what the gospel is all about. I'm not going to be preaching at you, just giving you information about the core text of the Christian faith. You cannot serve both God and empire. It's practically written exactly as such in the Bible. So this guy was not really involved in First Amendment protected activity, and even if he were, he totally deserved the protests anyway. So then arresting journalists for reporting on it is just another step towards what we'd consider a more overt style of so-called authoritarian dictatorship nature of the U.S. government. They have the secret police. They're arresting journalists for spreading stories that they don't like, using the most flimsy excuses imaginable. And of course, all the journalists are being racially profiled as well. So, it's another hit against the public from the white nationalist ruling class and the protection of their violent private army rampaging around the Twin Cities. Solidarity Television is an independent grassroots news organization. That means we rely exclusively on viewers like you. Support us at solidaritytelevision.org. Apple drops $2 billion on Israeli AI facial tracking company. January 29, 2026, via Gizmodo. Tim Cook had been standing on all the third rails this week. Days after hanging out with Donald Trump and attending the premiere of a documentary about First Lady Melania Trump, just hours after the U.S. Border Patrol gunned down Alex Pretti, Apple announced it is acquiring an Israeli AI company. According to the Financial Times, Apple dropped close to $2 billion to acquire QAI, a startup that specializes in tracking facial movements. According to Bloomberg, QAI's bread and butter is understanding silent communication, which it does by analyzing how a person's facial muscles move as they are speaking. The publication speculated that the startup's technology could eventually make its way into Apple's AirPods, which are expected to continue to get an infusion of AI features in the coming years. The tech could also find its way into FaceTime and future smart glasses and headset projects. Johnny Cerruti, Apple's senior vice president of hardware technologies and the company's most senior Israeli executive, said in a statement to Ynet News that Q is an exceptional company, pioneering new and creative ways to use imaging and machine learning technologies. We're excited to acquire the company led by Aviad, and even more excited about what lies ahead. The Aviad in that statement is Aviad Measles, the co-founder of QAI. He's no stranger to Apple. Back in 2005, he started a 3D sensor company called PrimeSense that lent its technology to the early versions of Microsoft's Xbox Kinect, a motion sensing controller system. The company would eventually be acquired by Apple in 2013 and become the foundation for Face ID, Apple's facial recognition authentication system that it released in 2017. Measles hung out at Apple until a couple of years ago, where he set back on his own to launch QAI. There's a decent chance the acquisition won't sit particularly well with at least a portion of Apple's workforce, which has been pushing for years now for Apple to divest from Israel. The company has been accused of matching worker donations to the Israeli Defense Forces, which carried out what the United Nations determined was a genocide against Palestinians in Gaza, and to organizations involved in building illegal settlements in the occupied territories. The company has also operated research and development facilities in Israel for nearly a decade. According to a report from CTEC, about 30% of QAI's employees were drafted into the IDF military service after Hamas carried out an attack on Israel on October 7, 2023. Apple investing billions into Israel. Who could have seen that coming? I don't know. Not a whole lot of surprises this week. Buying Israeli AI companies. As if you can think of something more disgusting than an Israeli AI company. Like, what, they take all the water from Palestine already. Disgusting. These AI corporations are a real piece of work, and of course Israelis are worthless. So, but not to Apple, they're worth $2 billion, or it was $3 billion, or whatever, how much it was, in order to buy AI to track people's faces. Wow, I wonder where the Israelis came up with that one, or how they developed, or what they're using it on. Spoiler alert, they use this all to surveil Palestinians, and they use Palestinians as their human test subjects to develop surveillance equipment that they can then sell to the West. And this is why the United States keeps giving them bombs, so that way they can do continued testing on Palestinian civilians, and they don't have to use white people, I guess, to do it, or something. The relationship between the United States and Israel is nothing short of the American master with the Israeli dog on a leash, and lets the dog sniff around and bite whoever it wants. And in exchange, it gets some benefits like AI and surveillance and weapons testing. Like the U.S. service dogs that they give titanium teeth to in order to bite Arabs more painfully, that they then have to have the teeth removed when they come home, so they got nothing but gums left. That's us in Israel. So I just can't wait for us to start pulling out those fucking teeth. Anyway, in the meantime, we're getting these bullshit AIs like QAI. And we're all supposed to be excited because they're buying, Israeli tech startups. As if that's anything to get excited about. I'd rather see an Israeli restaurant with authentic Israeli food than another goddamn tech startup. But, they get all their healthcare and education paid for at the U.S. tax dollars because, of course, they do it for us. So what do we get out of it? Nothing. We get surveillance. American civilians get surveilled better by the United States government. That's why we give all the money to Israel. And that's what these corporations want, to do more surveillance and more data, AI data centers, to power facial tracking so that way they can better track people's facial expressions and facial movements. I guess the one surprise is I actually didn't know that Xbox Kinect was related to Israeli startups. That's kind of gross. I never used it anyway, but I don't know. That's disappointing. I guess not particularly surprising now that we know more about what Bill Gates was up to. We'll hand that to the conservatives. They never did like him. for all the wrong reasons, but their intuition was correct on that one. Give them that. They're Apple's big supporter of genocide. They match IDF donations made by their workers. So if good little Apple employee decides that the most overfunded terror organization on Earth, well, second most overfunded terror organization on Earth, following, of course, the United States Armed Forces, needs a little bit of extra spending cash so that way they can murder children and then go on vacation to Ibiza and buy more than one lunch, Apple will match that donation. So I guess our one hope is that 30% of this AI company's employees are IDF soldiers. Disgusting. It's stomach turning, and it's just repulsive. I mean, you think AI is bad enough, and you think Israel's bad enough, and now we have IDF-run AI corporations. Ugh, disgusting. I guess the one benefit or the one optimistic aspect of this is that it's going to cause problems within Apple because a lot of the staff are no longer able to tolerate Israeli war crimes. Luckily, a lot of the West is no longer willing to tolerate Israeli war crimes. And I guess the small hope is that they did previously because they didn't know any better, and they were deliberately kept from knowing any better. Although the information was never really hidden in the first place. You just had to ask any Palestinian, and they would have told you, and had been telling for, almost a century now. Westerners just had no reason to listen because they were dirty brown Muslim Arabs and not pretty clean white Europeans like the Israelis. Luckily, that's changed. Not enough to matter because, the Western citizens aren't exactly trying to turn the levers of power or stop the wheels of the war machine. But, maybe this sort of, I don't know what to call it. I don't even want to call it mutiny, but this discontent within the ranks of Apple will lead somewhere. Apple, of course, we know, even all of their Israeli stuff aside, is a terrible company. Everyone who's ever owned an Apple product has probably complained about their chargers constantly changing. Just as one example of the way that they fleece the consumer. And they're just a status symbol. And not even particularly, good products either. So, and definitely not good software. There's a reason why all the schools buy MacBooks and then immediately change out the OS. That's a different conversation. I'm not going to get into the tech wars. But, yeah, $2 billion Apple wants to give, or is giving, to Israel to get AI facial scanning technology to put in its AirPods for some reason. And, of course, this is just going to lead to more private corporate surveillance on top of the, public government surveillance. So if you guys have Apple stocks or bonds, get rid of them. Don't buy more Apple products. Don't buy into anything that's going to be running, especially Israeli AI surveillance on behalf of private corporations, Israel, or the United States government. Hey, it'd mean a lot if you join our Patreon at solidaritytelevision.org. There's always more news than we have time to cover. Here's a brief rundown on some of the other articles you might have missed this week. Measles cases prompt quarantine, other steps at ICE facility in Texas. DHS says, February 2nd, 2026 via Reuters. 2 measles cases confirmed among detainees at ICE facility in Texas. Texas Democrats called for a shutdown of Dilley Immigration Processing Center. ICE has been at the forefront of Trump's hardline immigration policies. 2 CBP agents identified in Alex Pretti shooting, February 1st, 2026, via ProPublica. The 2 federal immigration agents who fired on Minneapolis protester Alex Pretti are now identified in government records as Border Patrol agent Jesus Ochoa and Customs and Border Protection Officer Raimundo Gutierrez. ICE claimed that a man shattered his skull running into a wall, triggers tension at Minnesota hospital, January 31, 2026, via ABC 7 New York. In Minneapolis, intensive care nurses immediately doubted the word of federal immigration enforcers when they arrived at a Minneapolis hospital with a Mexican immigrant who had broken bones in his face and skull. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents initially claimed Alberto Castañeda Mondragon had tried to flee while handcuffed and purposefully ran headfirst into a brick wall, according to court documents filed by a lawyer seeking his release. But staff members at Hennepin County Medical Center determined that could not possibly account for the fractures and bleeding throughout the 31-year-old's brain, said 3 nurses familiar with the case. It was laughable, if there was something to laugh about, said one of the nurses, who spoke to the Associated Press on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss patient care. There is no way this person ran headfirst into a wall. The explanation from ICE is an example of recent run-ins between immigration officers and healthcare workers that have contributed to mounting friction at Minneapolis hospitals. Workers at the Hennepin County facility say that ICE officers have restrained patients in defiance of hospital rules and stayed at their sides for days. The agents have also lingered around the campus and pressed people for proof of citizenship. Judge bars prosecutors from seeking death penalty against Luigi Mangione, January 30th via Huffington Post. A judge has ruled that federal prosecutors can't seek the death penalty against Luigi Mangione in the killing of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. U.S. District Judge Margaret Garnett dismissed a federal murder charge that had enabled prosecutors to seek capital punishment, finding that it was technically flawed. She wrote that she did so to foreclose the death penalty as an available punishment to be considered by the jury, as it weighs whether to convict Mangione. Garnett also dismissed a firearm charge but left in place stalking charges that carry a maximum punishment of life in prison. In order to seek the death penalty, prosecutors needed to show that Mangione killed Thompson while committing another crime of violence. Stalking does not fit that definition. Former Illinois deputy sentenced to 20 years in prison for killing Sonya Massey, January 9, 2026, via KCRA. A former Illinois sheriff's deputy was sentenced Thursday to 20 years in prison for fatally shooting Sonya Massey, who had dialed 911 to report a possible prowler outside her Springfield home. Sonya Massey's murder happened on July 6, 2024. Legislature House passes bill that would criminalize protesting in a mask without a doctor's note, January 29, 2026, via Alabama Political Reporter. HB 168 by State Representative Jamie Keel of Russellville creates an exemption to allow masking during protests, but police could require the protester to produce documented medical guidance to substantiate the applicability of this exemption. The American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama raised concerns about the law in 2020 as everyday Alabamians became required to wear masks in public near constantly, prompting Attorney General Steve Marshall to share his opinion on the law. Paris prosecutors raid Twitter offices as part of an investigation into child abuse images, February 3, 2026, via Houston Public Media. French prosecutors raided the offices of social media platform Twitter on Tuesday as part of a preliminary investigation into allegations including spreading child sexual abuse images and deepfakes. They have also summoned billionaire owner Elon Musk for questioning. Twitter and Musk's artificial intelligence company Twitter AI also face intensifying scrutiny from Britain's data privacy regulator, which opened formal investigations into how they handled personal data when they developed and deployed Musk's artificial intelligence chatbot Grok. OpenAI working on social media network that could require creepy eye scans, January 29, 2026, via Gizmodo. OpenAI, the company best known for its AI applications like ChatGPT and Sora, is reportedly working on a social media network designed to be free from AI bots. The catch is that users may need to have their irises scanned for access. Forbes reported Wednesday, citing unnamed sources familiar with the project, that the platform is still in very early stages and is being developed by a small team of fewer than 10 people. The goal is to create a human-only social platform that would require users to prove that they're real people. To do that, the team is reportedly considering implementing identity verification through Apple's Face ID or through the Orb, an Orwellian eye-scanning device made by a company that was also conveniently founded by OpenAI CEO Sam Altman. Thanks for joining us for this week's episode of The People's Report. Don't forget to subscribe at solidaritytelevision.org. Organizing the working classes of the world in solidarity forever.